Hello, this is Dr. Norris, and I am very, very, very pleased that today that we're going to have Dr. Akman joining us today as a part of our LGBTQI interview series for Pride Month. Dr. Akman, I want to thank you and welcome you to the interview.
Thank you, Dr. Norris. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay. So, Dr. Akman, you have a very, very, very long history at GW. You actually recruited me to the Department of Psychiatry along with Dr. Griffith when you were still chair of the Department of Psychiatry. But Dr. Akman, for our community and learners and attendings and fellows and residents and people who may not know you, could you tell or share with us a bit of your history with the GW community and medical enterprise?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm Dr. Jeffrey Akman. I'm a cis gay man, and I came to GW for medical school in 1977. When
Wow.
I came here in 1977, I was not out. I
Mm,
was in the closet, and I was closeted. I was aware of a same-sex attraction, but I was uh, really not at a place in my life psychologically or really beginning medical school where I felt comfortable coming out.
hmm.
Um, and, as medical school evolved, I became closer and closer to coming out. There were certainly gay people, LGBT people around me that I was aware of. One of the associate deans of the medical school at that time, a Dr. Winfield Scott, was openly
Oh.
gay. There
Hmm.
were a couple faculty members that were openly gay. And it wasn't really until my psychiatry residency at GW, which started in 1981, where I came out. And it really was around the beginning of the HIV/AIDS epidemic.
Hmm.
So as AIDS started affecting young gay men across the country, GW Hospital really became an
Hmm.
epicenter for HIV/AIDS in the Mid-Atlantic region. We had the most cases. DuPont Circle
Hmm.
was, essentially adjacent to GW Hospital, which was a large gay community. And I found myself going into the rooms of these young gay men who were coming into the hospital almost invariably to die.
Oh my
It was
goodness.
a time before the antibody test. We
Hmm.
didn't know how it was transmitted. It was a scary time. And I was probably on the psychiatry consultation service as a resident, and then as a chief resident was on the inpatient unit of the hospital. I was the chief
Hmm.
resident on the inpatient unit. And so I literally would find the patients in the hospital and go and sit in their rooms and talk to them and find out what was going on. At the time, um, AIDS dementia was a very serious problem. And so I
Hmm.
was very interested in the neuropsychiatric aspects, the issues around sexuality, death and dying, et cetera, et cetera. Um, the infectious disease docs became aware that this young gay psychiatry
Hmm.
resident was seeing patients. They started referring patients to me as a
Hmm.
resident. Um, I joined the faculty of the GW Department of Psychiatry in 1985.
Wow.
And at that point, I was already identified as a local expert in HIV/AIDS.
Hmm.
Um, and I was out. I was certainly the first openly gay member of the psychiatry faculty at
Okay.
GW. There had been other psychiatry residents who were also gay while I was out as a resident, but none on the faculty. There were some
Hmm.
gay faculty members, but were closeted.
Hmm.
Um, so I applied for an NIMH grant early on in my tenure on the faculty, and I got it. It was really to do HIV education. And all of a sudden, I was traveling around the country educating physicians, health professionals, psychiatrists on
Wow.
HIV/AIDS. I started working in the American Psychiatric Association on
Hmm.
HIV/AIDS related issues. And locally, I started helping build the Whitman Walker Clinic community response to HIV/AIDS. This was in the
Hmm.
1980s. There was no AIDS response at that point. So I was
Hmm.
volunteering in the community. I was doing work nationally, and I was building a practice.
Wow.
At the time, my friends were dying, my patients were dying, everybody was dying. It was the early part of the epidemic. There was no treatment. By 85, we at least had an antibody test. But, there was an enormous amount of stigma. There was an enormous amount of fear. And it was, very, very heady time with so much death and dying.
Yes.
Um, I found myself during that time becoming much bolder in my
Okay.
willingness to be
Okay.
out,
Okay.
and be publicly identified as gay. I remember the chairman of my department at the time said to me, Jeff, if you get this NIH grant to do HIV/AIDS work, people are going to think you're gay, and that's going to hurt your academic career. And I said, well, Dr. Weiner, who was the chair, I have a calling for this. And
Wow.
if people think I'm gay, so be it. But the risk was great. The risk was
Mm-hmm.
great in terms of the stigma, the risk of discrimination. But it was an incredibly compelling time. Um, that those early days of HIV/AIDS, which now led to, it really became the foundation of my career. I
Mm-hmm.
became an expert and helped build the field of HIV/AIDS psychiatry. I became an expert in
Mm-hmm.
LGBTQ mental health and LGBTQ psychiatry. And it really, so when the question becomes sort of how has your identity
Yes.
influenced your professional career, they're fully intertwined. They're fully
Wow.
intertwined.
Wow.
Right.
Dr. Akman, and for those listening, this is some of these aspects of his personal and professional journey I knew of, other aspects that I didn't. But as it strikes me right now, particularly in the early years, I wanted to just hear a bit more from you when you described that you were going into the rooms yourself, a young psychiatrist with people, they were dying. And, what at that point in time, what did you learn from that experience that further like informed your practice and whom you are? You kind of already spoke to in terms of the passion and the calling. And then the other thing that I'm also very curious about, because I haven't heard the full story behind this in terms of Whitman Walker and the building of that. I just wanted to, if you wanted to expound just a little bit more on those points. I was just, because I think that there are many lessons that are applicable to now in this environment of COVID that you particularly could share with us and during that time.
So I think when it came to the patients, um, I, just early on, there was a lot of fear as to how it was transmitted.
Hmm.
Food trays were being left out in the halls of patients in hospitals. Doctors were refusing to care for the patients. But a big part was stigma. It wasn't the
Hmm.
fear of the transmission, it was stigma. People not
Hmm.
wanting to take care of homosexual patients, and the stigma of HIV/AIDS. So my going into the room was, for number one, for me to learn, but number
Okay.
two, to provide witness and to provide some sort of support
Hmm.
and to help identify if, in fact, there was anything treatable from the psychiatric or neuropsychiatric or mental health side, as it related to either the cognitive decline,
Hmm.
the depression, or helping these individuals deal with the the challenges of their families
Hmm.
coming into the hospital, not knowing that many of them were gay. So
Hmm.
for many individuals, they were coming out through this, diagnosis.
Hmm.
I realized early on that I had a lot to offer, that the ability to sit and talk and
Hmm.
engage and be there for someone going through this, which frequently was very, very isolating, and very scary for the individuals with AIDS. And I remember, again, so many of my friends were dying too. I was going to
Hmm.
memorial services, and people were like, well, aren't you depressed and aren't you sad about this? Well, clearly I was sad, but it was very gratifying to find myself in a place where I felt like I was helping somebody simply by being present
Hmm.
and by acknowledging the pain, the suffering, and the impending loss that was clearly coming down the pike. I mean, in those days, you had 6 months to 9 months. 9 months was on average the length of time people would live with AIDS
Hmm.
before the medicines started, being identified. So, what happened also was
Hmm.
other gay psychiatrists became very involved
Hmm.
nationally. And so I then
Okay.
started developing a peer group of other gay physicians and psychiatrists to support each other
Oh, wow.
as we began learning more about AIDS, but also to support us in our grief, in our own, the issues that we were dealing with, and in our own anxiety, because again,
Absolutely.
we didn't know if we had AIDS early on. We didn't know. There
Hmm.
was no test. So when we all started on this path, we didn't know.
Okay.
So, you know, I, all of this, sort of started at around the same time.
Hmm.
I was looking for ways to be
Hmm.
helpful and engaged. And Whitman Walker Clinic, it became clear that as an LGBTQ health clinic in those days, and it
Hmm.
was small because essentially in those days, in the 70s and 80s, it was an STD clinic for gay men,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? So they didn't have the capacity to deal with AIDS patients.
Hmm.
But many of us in the community started volunteering as patients showed up at Whitman Walker, and I started teaching other health professionals at Whitman Walker around HIV/AIDS. I was seeing patients at
Wow.
Whitman Walker pro bono. I was supervising the mental health staff, and
Hmm.
I was helping raise money. I became a member of the board of Whitman Walker and ultimately became president of the board of Whitman Walker
Wow.
Clinic. So I was probably, in addition to my busy clinical academic
Mhm.
job, I was also probably volunteering a minimum of 20 hours a week at Whitman Walker, helping build a response. Um, I also got involved in an organization called the National Lesbian Gay Health Association, which was a
Okay.
national organization to um, educate healthcare professionals on LGBT issues and
Hmm.
HIV, and became president of the National Lesbian Gay
Wow.
Health Association. So if ever I was questioned whether I was still in the closet, and you're president of the National Lesbian Gay Health Association, you're no longer in the closet. Not that I
No.
was at that point anyway. But that was also a very heady time because this was now, fast forward to 1990, we
Hmm.
held the first national transgender health conference in the
Wow.
country ever. And I was president of NLGHA at the time. So it was a very heady time also in terms of transgender health. So it was a very, very powerful time, very heady time, very gratifying.
Yes.
But now when I look back on it, I look back at so many of my friends and patients who passed away. So many. The losses were truly unimaginable. Um, and it just really wiped out, essentially, um, a generation of gay men and others. But that was a significant part, of what was happening in those days.
Well, Dr. Ackman, I mean, as you're speaking, I'm struck by so many things. One, I want to go back to what you said in regards to that idea of like your identity and your professional mission. I believe you're like they were intertwined, and and you continue to build and build and build. And something that also struck me as you were speaking was the number of this needed to be done. And if you were the first person to do it, it needed to happen, regardless of, I can only imagine myself, um, as I mentioned before to the audience, I mean, Dr. Akman was my chair, but I could only imagine talking to my chair and saying, well, if this hurts my career, then so be it. And I need to do this. So I just reflect upon that. I'm just, wow. And then we have the scholarship, the community service, all of those things going on. And again, that identity being a part of who you are in terms of your professional mission and being interwoven. And again, as we're continuing, to me, just from what I know, that's actually like maybe the first act of your career, as I understand it, because then you're going to go on and you'll share with us now, like as your career progressed in terms of different roles you played at GW, what was next after kind of being, if I heard you correctly, first faculty member in the Department of Psychiatry to be openly gay, all of the things that you've done for the community, the grants, the scholarship. What was next in your professional life in GW?
Yeah, so Lorenzo, you make a good point because number one, that was not my anticipated career path.
Mm-hmm.
I had actually been accepted into a child and adolescent fellowship at Children's National during my
Wow.
residency with the intention of becoming a child and adolescent psychiatrist. And when HIV hit and it got pulled me in such a personal way that I decided that really at that moment that that was my calling. That was and I went to the chair at the time of the psychiatry department at Children's National, and he said to me, Jeff, before I could even tell him that I wasn't going to do my fellowship, he said, Jeff, I understand that you've come out as a gay man, and I have a good psychoanalyst I can send you to that can help return you to being heterosexual. Okay. So
No.
discrimination, certainly within psychiatry in those days around LGBT issues, was significant because, in psychoanalytic theory, which was sort of the currency of the realm,
Okay.
homosexuality was psychopathology. And so when Dr. Wiener, my chair, said to me, this is going to hurt your career, it was very much linked to that.
Mm-hmm.
Psychoanalysts ran most of the academic departments, right? And I was viewed at that point, certainly by now the chair at Children's, as sick. I now was sick and I needed to be fixed. I needed to be treated, okay? In fact, I was in my own psychoanalysis at the time as part of, it was a very common thing in
Right.
psychiatry residencies those days. I was literally on the couch 4 times a week, laying down with the psychoanalyst behind me, okay? And he said to me, Jeff, you should apply to the Psychoanalytic Institute to become an analyst. I knew that the Psychoanalytic Institutes did not accept gay candidates. The requirement was that you had a successful psychoanalysis in those days, which meant that at the end of your psychoanalysis, you were straight. So I said to him, I'll never forget, I'm laying on the couch and he wanted me, he said, you're now well-known, you've got a national reputation. You should
Mm-hmm.
take on the Psychoanalytic Institute and their discriminatory policies. And I remember saying to him, I'm fighting AIDS. I can't fight the Psychoanalytic Institute. I don't care about the Psychoanalytic Institute. This is much more important to me. So my career paths had really started out with the intention of, I'm going into child and adolescent psychiatry. I'm going to
Wow.
be a psychoanalyst, and that's going to be my academic path. It didn't happen that way. When AIDS hit, I took that path and I never thought about what was coming down the pike. I never thought about
Wow.
what my future career was. This was so pressing. This was so important to me and to my community at the time that that's all I could see. Now, it turns out that as I was doing all of that, I was also, taking on more, teaching responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
I was in 1990,
Mm-hmm.
1991, one of my mentors, who was this openly gay dean in the
Mm-hmm.
medical school, Dr. Winfield Scott, he was an associate dean, he developed AIDS and died. And before he passed, he said to the dean of the school at that time, you should see if Jeff Akman is interested in taking my position as an assistant dean. And so the dean at that time, Robert Keimowitz,
Mm-hmm.
pulled me into his office. I had been involved in medical school committees, um, all related to, school regulations, et
Mm-hmm.
cetera. Helped write the honor code. I led the committee at that time to create the honor
Mm-hmm.
code as a faculty member. And he asked me if I would take the position, and I did. And so in 1991, I became an assistant dean, part-time,
Mm-hmm.
and stayed in that position for 10 years. Throughout my psychiatry time, I continued to see AIDS patients,
Mm-hmm.
see my LGBT patients. That whole part of my practice grew.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in 2000, the dean of the school at that time, the chairman of the psychiatry department left unexpectedly, and he asked me to if I would be open to serving in an interim capacity as chair
Mm-hmm.
of the department. Um, and I said yes. And then a few years later, I was made the permanent chair. It was not a path that I was, you know, uh,
Yeah.
had drawn out for myself. It was
Uh,
not a path, right?
yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I'm just.
it,
Please continue. I just have to interject here for the. I've known Dr. Akman now since 2006, and this is the first time I've actually heard those aspects of your story, and it makes a lot of sense to me in terms of the way in which I'm going to get the way you lead and the way you interact with others. And now I'm like, oh, I didn't know that. Please continue. I'm just yeah.
so, throughout those early part
Yeah.
of my career, there were many times where I was um, there were plenty opportunities in terms of discrimination,
Mm-hmm.
microaggressions. I remember a
Mm-hmm.
seminar leader of mine when I was a resident saying to the group, all gay men have borderline and narcissistic pathology. And that was the thinking at that time. And again, it was an insult to me. It was
Yeah.
I was really hurt by it. And I
Mm-hmm.
stood up and I said to her, Dr. So-and-so, that's not the case. I don't believe that the people that I'm seeing in my practice or me or my friends or by definition have narcissistic and borderline personality disorder. In any event, those kinds of, um, you know, verbal, where you're being insulted and
Yes.
the microaggressions and the, but the bottom line is I had a certain uh, I think it was really because of what was happening around me in terms
Yeah.
of HIV. I wouldn't tolerate this. The stakes
Yeah.
were too
Yeah.
high. The stakes were
Yeah.
too high. People were dying. People needed help. Ronald Reagan wasn't saying the word AIDS, right? The
Mm-hmm.
stakes were too high. I started getting involved in activism,
Mm-hmm.
marches, right? You really had to confront all the bigotry, the
Mm-hmm.
stigma, the discrimination. And and then I think most importantly, I just was me. I just lived my life. I just,
Mm-hmm.
lived my truth, who I was,
Right.
and people respected that. They saw that I was a person of integrity. They saw that I was, um, you know, uh, not, yeah. And so I think in that, the students respond. I was a good teacher. The students
Yeah.
responded. I got good teaching reviews. I worked very hard on committees,
Mm-hmm.
all of those things. And I think that over time, people respected that. And I was very fortunate that I was in an organization
Mm-hmm.
that was, in fact, inclusive and supportive, and allowed me to be who I was,
Right.
right? I
Yeah.
was in an organization. I was very, very fortunate at the time that I was supported,
Yeah.
right?
And Dr. Ackman, I want to just add something to this because now we've gotten through assistant dean and now we're at the start of your chairmanship. And I came to the Department of Psychiatry in 2006, and there's so many things that stand out during your chairmanship, but some of the things that stood out to me just on a personal level, and I mentioned this in an interview with Dr. Kajula, was that as the chair of our department, for me personally, I felt like you allowed me to just be who I wanted to be. You're like, Lorenzo, you gave me guidance and direction. You were a chair of your word, but more importantly, you supported and backed and said, be who you're going to be. The other things that people, and I think this also speaks to, in my opinion, one of the other reasons that people would relate, want to follow, and be led by you. I always said, every Thursday morning, I could go in and Dr. Akman's office would be open and we would talk basketball.
Yes.
Yes, exactly. And I still miss that when you eventually went to the dean's office. That hurt me so much. I was just like, but your door was always open. And they were like, it wasn't like, you're like, yeah. We were like, significant debates to folks listening. And then the other thing that you told me, really important, because I remember I was young, 2000, maybe 7 or something about that. And there were opportunities, because that's GW, like a lot of opportunities, boom, 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 boom. And you actually said 2 things. She's like, 1, do not, don't grab the first thing. It will come. And then there's something that actually informs how I think about things now. I was telling you, like, I'm going to do this, or I'm going to come in on weekends, and I'm going to do this. And you start, it's like, okay, Lorenzo, okay. And then you're like, actually, Lorenzo, no. In this department, you are not going to do that. You are not going to come in on weekends and and there are a lot of things I could pick, but those are like 3 of the things, because I was just like, whoa, he's different. I mean, he's definitely, I felt as though not only was I allowed to be myself, someone was actively caring and investing in who I am as a person, and was not going to let a short-term reward or anything potentially undermine future potential. So I just share that with folks, because I think, to me, that's when I think of you, that's many ways I think of those type of things, that your ability to establish that personal relationship with others. Please.
Well, I'm in the context of this conversation. First of all, it was wonderful to be able to recruit and hire you as a member of the faculty. But I think about, what I was like in those days, and the number of losses that I had experienced, and the lessons. First of all, not only seeing myself, in terms of a certain resilience,
yes,
but also I felt, a lot of lessons learned about life early on. I mean, I'm in my 30s. I'm losing so many friends. I'm losing so many patients. And what's important in life, and how do you think about life and family, and sort of priorities, and there's no right answer here, but it's important. And I wasn't expecting at that stage of my life to have carried around all of that loss. But it's also one of the things that happens in terms of gay identity development is, in many ways, you're not sure where your path is going to take you in your own identity, right? It's a lifelong process. Before I came out of the closet, yes, I had a same-sex attraction, but I didn't have an identity as being gay, right? So I'm building an identity as being gay, as I'm also building an academic and professional identity. They're happening simultaneously. And I think that most people, unless you were sitting behind me on the couch in my psychoanalysis, were unaware of that. We're unaware of the fact that, in the 1980s and 90s, as I'm building my professional career, I'm building my identity as a gay man. I'm in the early phases of my identity development, of comfort, of not feeling ashamed, of having that sense of confidence. And if you're straight, you're not going through that. You're not having to try on a whole new identity. I grew up thinking I was straight, right? I did. I grew up thinking I was straight, and all of a sudden I had to shift and say, okay, I've got to take on a whole new internal sense of myself and
Okay.
start building that. And so when, you think about, I'm reminded of a quote by Tennessee Williams, the
Hmm.
probably the greatest American playwright. He was a gay
Hmm.
man.
Hmm.
And he said, if you can't be yourself, why would you be anyone else? Okay.
All right.
And that's so true in terms of in general, but it's
Hmm.
particularly true for people who are dealing with, shame and stigma
Hmm.
and are closeted. And how do
Hmm.
you evolve and become yourself and live your true sense of self? Um, and it's a process. And,
Yeah.
I think in the context of, gay identity development, we think, well, I came out when I was a resident in
Okay.
psychiatry. Well, the the reality is the if you're LGBTQ, you're always coming out. You're always coming out, right?
Wow.
You walk into a room, especially as a chair of a psychiatry department or
Yes.
as a dean,
Yes.
people assume I'm straight. People, if they don't know me, right?
Hmm.
When I was chair of the psychiatry department, there
Yeah.
were no other gay chairs. When in GW, there were
Hmm.
no other gay chairs nationally in academic psychiatry departments.
Okay.
When I became dean of the medical school at GW, I was the very first openly gay vice
Yes, sir.
president in GW's 200-year history. I was the first openly gay dean in GW's 200-year
All right.
history. I was the first openly gay dean of a medical, according to Daryl Kirsch, the former head of the AAMC.
Yeah.
I don't know that
But,
for a fact, but that's what he told me, right? I don't, but the bottom line is there is the expectation, the
hmm.
assumption, right, that you're straight. And unless you're there with a same-sex partner or
Hmm.
somehow your identity is so prominent and people know when you walk into the room. But, I representing GW internationally, walking into
Hmm.
meetings in Saudi Arabia, they didn't think I was a gay man.
Mm.
Walking into meetings in China, they don't. So you're constantly deciding: are you coming out or not? Are you going to,
Constantly
present
decide.
yourself as
Hmm.
yourself, or are you going to hide? So this whole process
Yes.
of coming out, it's a lifetime process. It's probably my you know, one piece of advice to all of the students, to anyone
Okay.
else, it never ends, right? It doesn't
Right.
end, right? I felt as Dean of the School of Medicine and Health
Hmm.
Sciences, it was important for me to come out in meetings with alumni, in meetings with students, if they didn't know. I wanted them to know because it's not something I'm ashamed of. It's
Hmm.
who I am, right?
Hmm.
So, I think that when I think about through the years, advising and mentoring gay students or gay residents, do you come out in your applications? Do you come out as you're applying for a residency
Hmm.
or a job? Those calculations are always taking place for someone who's LGBTQ. You're
All right.
always thinking, should I come out?
No.
Should I not? Is there the potential I'm going to be discriminated against
Hmm.
or not? So I got to a certain point in my career
Hmm.
where, and it actually was early on, where I just said, the stakes are too high. I
Hmm.
cannot remain closeted. I cannot remain,
Hmm.
I can't present myself as somebody I'm not. And people respected that. Not
Yeah.
everybody, it's not like I didn't, haven't been verbally assaulted, physically
Hmm.
assaulted, discriminated against. I've had all those experiences. I've been spit on for being gay. I mean, in my face. I've had all those experiences, right?
Hmm.
It's a, it's, um, but at the end of the day, as Tennessee Williams says, why would you be anyone else, right? You have to be
Why?
yourself,
Why
right?
would you be anyone else? Dr. Akman, I mean, there's so much that you kind of not you definitely laid out, and the idea of constantly deciding to come out. That's going to be something, again, that's going to stick with me. But you also, you mentioned the word resilience, and you talked about it. And I was wondering if you could share with us, from your perspective, what are the different, if you will, challenges that a learner, a student will have now compared to what you went through in terms of that, the dual forming of one's identity and professional gay identity or LGBTQ identity, as well as professional identity? There may be no differences. I don't know. I'm engaging in curiosity. So if I sound ignorant, I apologize, but I would like to hear kind of your thoughts and perspective on that, from when at your time compared to what learners face now.
Well, I think, excuse me, the world is a little different, at least in terms of the United States and opportunities for people who are openly LGBTQ. And, you know, the opinions, feelings about, you know, people who are LGBT have improved. For example, when you have something like, you know, the Supreme Court, you know, coming down, and recently, pretty much opinion after opinion has been supportive of LGBTQ individuals, not 100%. And so you're coming into a world that's much more supportive and inclusive, and includes sexual orientation and gender identity as part of the broad definition of diversity and inclusion. And most organizations now, unless you're a sort of a fundamental faith-based organization that views homosexuality as a sin, most organizations now see this as part of the overall, you know, definition of diversity. And so I think that the support, the opportunities are greater than they certainly were in the 70s and 80s. That doesn't mean that there aren't challenges and there aren't difficulties. And one of the things I'm involved in right now is the American Medical Association Foundation. It's a commission on LGBTQ fellowships, specifically addressing significant health disparities in the LGBTQ community. And again, similar to other health disparities related to race or ethnicity, et cetera, it's the social determinants that are relevant to these disparities in the LGBTQ. Now, why do those social determinants exist? Because of discrimination, because of stigma, et cetera. So it's not like the world is pro-gay, right? But it's a lot better than it used to be. And there are opportunities to get support and mentorship from other LGBT individuals and leaders, and organizations are very likely to have support groups for people who are LGBT, whether it's a medical school or whether it's a GW faculty, et cetera. So there are opportunities to find peers, colleagues, mentors that I think was less likely back when I was growing up. And I think that folks need to take advantage of that.
Dr. Akman, I wanted to follow up on that, because when you just spoke now, you have done so much, again, whether it is faculty, chair, dean, national level representation. I believe that you, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that you were on the White House, on one or two White House task force, specifically, if I'm thinking about that correctly. But one of the things that I wanted to hear from you now in your career, what is your focus now? What is your passion at this stage, things that you were focused on in regards to kind of, again, your journey in as a leader, and what your vision is showing you? Like, where are you putting your energy and efforts currently?
So good question. So I started this path with a strong interest in becoming a psychiatrist. That's the core of who I am as a physician, as a professional. And during my 9 years as vice president for health affairs and
Hmm.
as dean, I got further and further away from that.
Okay.
Um, I continued to practice early on in my tenure as VPHA and dean, but then had to give it up. But now I'm really excited about getting that back, right? Becoming the practicing physician,
Hmm.
psychiatrist, and tapping back into that
Wow.
part of me, and because I missed it.
Hmm.
And so I'm really looking forward to, now that my tenure in the administration is over, is coming back into the psychiatry department, starting to see patients again. I suspect I'll see a fair number of LGBTQ and HIV/AIDS patients, but when I was chair, I was seeing a much broader, spectrum of patients than that. So we'll see. I'm currently, as I said, I'm on the AMA commission for LGBTQ fellowships, but I'm also on the National Veterans Administration
Wow.
Special Medical Advisory Group, and we report up to the Secretary of the VA on veterans' health issues and medical issues. And I'm finding that very rewarding, and really tapping into the mission of the VA and
Okay.
supporting those people who serve our country in the military and then are, in need of medical and healthcare. So that's
Hmm.
something that I'm doing, and I'm sort of getting back involved in psychiatric organizations, whether it's the APA or the
Hmm.
American College, to find myself and tap back into my old friends and peers and that part of my identity.
Yeah. Well, I can speak for the Department of Psychiatry. We are absolutely pleased to just even have you back
Thank
at our
you.
meetings. Absolutely. But Dr. Ackman, another thing I wanted to just, you touched upon it, but I'm not sure that everyone completely understands it. And I certainly don't think that I even completely understand it, but I did think that I was able to maybe see a bit of it when again, when I saw you progress from chair to dean. There's something that always struck me is that leadership has a cost. And I'd have to imagine leadership as a gay man has a cost. And to me, you were paying it. You were willing to pay it. And I don't know if you felt comfortable, if you could talk like, what is the cost of leadership? Because I mean, you were vice president of health affairs, dean, first, pretty much everything. And I would imagine that, other than your partner, your significant other, no one really probably understands the true costs that came at. But I always reflected upon that as I saw you lead, and I don't know if you have any thoughts or did you feel comfortable sharing about that?
Yeah, first of all, it was a very, very rewarding and gratifying experience. We accomplished a lot, and I was fortunate and I do think that I'm a good judge of talent and
Mhm.
people, and maybe that's partly being a psychiatrist, and I felt like I was truly able to recruit and hire a very, very strong team, including yourself, into the dean's office to really, I think, we did a tremendous amount when I was in the dean's office, whether it was increasing research, whether it was
Mhm.
transforming the curriculum,
Mhm.
building all kinds of programs, including diversity, equity, and
Mhm.
inclusion programs, and an
Mhm.
office of diversity and inclusion. Um, the cost is that you're, first of all, it is a 24/7
Yeah.
job, 24/7.
Sure.
Um, you don't know what you don't know,
Mm.
and you're responsible for things that you don't know that come up. So when there are challenges that you're faced that you haven't really, you didn't generate the problem, you're still responsible for it. It's so that weighs on you. And I think but in most cases, I have found those leadership opportunities greatly, greatly outweigh
Mhm.
the costs.
Mm.
And I've grown, I've aged in them. No, there's no
Mhm.
question about it. Um, and but you also, you lose a little bit of the privacy. You
Mm,
lose a little bit of the privacy. Your life's not your own. There's
mm,
expectations that you're pretty much always on. And I, you know, for the most part, I'm fine with that. But, at the end of my 9 years, it was really good to have a year sabbatical and get some
mm-hmm,
R&R, because I had been on nonstop
mm-hmm.
uh, for those 10 years as chair and the 9 years um, uh, as vice president and dean. And it was good to have a break. It was good to
Okay.
relax. I do remember for much of those years, I did try to continue to, go to the gym, work out, those
Mm-hmm.
kinds of things, but it's tough. It's tough to manage all of that. And but I don't regret any of it. It was all terrific, and hopefully there'll be some additional leadership opportunities down the road. But I'm not there yet. I'm almost there.
Yeah. Well, uh, Dr. Akman, I want to thank you for speaking with us. And just as there's so many important things that you spoke of, being your authentic self, um, always making decisions and choices. Um, but one of the things that I'm just going to say that sticks with me is how you described your path. And this, you've been described by others, including myself, but definitely by others, it is kind of that servant leadership model.
Yeah.
But when I actually think about it, I think about, like, what's the core of GW? What's the spirit? And I'm probably just gonna just kind of I feel like we're a community, and you exemplify that of, like, the stakes are too high. I have to do something. No, I'm not. I mean, no, I'm not trying to do this to necessarily be a leader, to get a publication, or to do any of that. There are people dying. The stakes are too high. There's too many disparities. I need to do something. And I think when you spoke to that, and I feel a strong sense of pride when you speak to it, like, because I feel like that's the GW spirit. I remember one time you shared with me, like, I think maybe it was in the war, people, like, we were having stuff in our, like, GW community. They were having things in their houses. They were doing things. But when you speak about that, I think you exemplify that to me, that's the spirit. Like, the stakes are too high. It has to be done. And I'm going to do it with my team, with my community. Dr. Akman, it has been a pleasure. Please be safe, be well, continue to lead, continue to share your visions with us. And I look forward to speaking with you again.
Okay. Really appreciate that. Thank you, Dr. Norris. Thanks, Lorenzo.